My name is John Bonifaz. I'm the co-founder and president of Free Speech for People. And we're so pleased to have all of you with us for this special briefing, Democracy Under Attack, How We Fight Back, co-hosted with our friends at Women Donors Network, Carol Winograd, Jenny Tompkins, and Holly Mosher. We really want to thank all three of them for their leadership and all the critical support we've received from members of the Women Donors Network for our work at Free Speech for People in fighting to protect our right to vote and our democracy. Today, this special briefing will focus on two key areas of that work. First, around new litigation that we have initiated this year to challenge new voter suppression laws in Arizona and Texas. And then around the work that we've initiated this year to seek to uphold Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which prohibits any elected official who has taken an oath of office and then turned around and incited or engaged in insurrection from appearing on any future ballot. And we've sought to ensure that election officials all across the country uphold that mandate, and we'll be discussing that as well. But first, to start us off, I want to turn this over to Carol Winograd, who is going to make some opening remarks. Carol, thank you.
Thank you, John. This has been great working with you. So I'll give a brief history of how I got involved in this. Like many of us in 2016, when Trump was elected, it was a wake-up call. And Marjorie Loeb, who was a beloved member of WDN from Texas, daughter was working with Ian Bassin on what turned out to become Protect Democracy. And she contacted me to support this new effort because there were people in the Obama administration who were very worried that we were going to slide into authoritarianism under the Trump administration. And unfortunately, that was true. So we became early adopters on that. And as a result of that, have become much more aware of the attack on democracy that has evolved over the past period of time since the Trump election. And that included being aware of security issues related to voting machines and voter suppression. And we learned about a voter suppression effort in Georgia with the Stacey Abrams election, where voters were being taken off the polls. And there was a lot of difficulty getting to the polls and differential opportunities for people who were white and black, and no surprises there. So this gradually evolved in my thinking that this was something that needed to be worked on. So I, through various serendipitous things, came into talking with a variety of people who were working in this arena, and in particular, a for-profit law firm that did mostly stuff for unions at a cut rate for them. And then when they would win, they could get their fees back at full rate. And so I tried to raise money through WDN to support their efforts in Georgia. And the response then, and this is probably 2018 or so, was, oh, this is all being taken care of by the Brennan Center. Don't worry about it. We don't need this. And anyway, it should be pro bono lawyers, and it shouldn't be private lawyers, and it shouldn't be nonprofits, and basically forget about it. At that, I'm not donating. Holly and Jenny and a couple of other people, Holly and Jenny were the main people who responded. And we then indeed worked with that private law firm and managed to get what eventually was new machines for Georgia. And the 2020 election in Georgia was run in part because of winning that case. And we also won a case in Florida where Puerto Ricans, because there's a law in the voting rights bill that was decimated, but this piece of it wasn't, that if American citizens grow up in schools that do not teach English, then they, in their elections, can have election materials in their language. And that turned out to be very significant for Puerto Ricans in Florida, who, because of all the hurricane stuff and all the stuff that went on with the Trump administration, many had moved there. So every single county in Florida now has to have Spanish-speaking materials because of that same case. So that encouraged me to continue. And then somehow Free Speech for People found us, or I found them, and I don't now remember. Maybe John does, but I don't. And so we got involved in their work. And it's pretty clear to me that what we really have is a complex ecosystem of a variety of organizations that are working on this problem, which is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And yes, the Brennan Center does fabulous work. And yes, Protect Democracy does fabulous work. And yes, the law firm that we worked with in Georgia and Florida does fabulous work. And they're all doing a piece of it. And because there are multiple groups, we can attack different aspects of the problem because it's way too big for any one group. And we need to be nimble to take, a bite here and a bite there in order for all the bites to take hold. So I think it's really terrific that FSFP is doing the work now on the voter suppression in Arizona and in Texas, and are working on the 14th Amendment, which was developed because of the Confederate folks who wanted to run for the US government after they had been part of the insurrection. And that's where the 14th Amendment, Section 3 comes from. And I think we're revisiting that issue right now. And thank you, John and FSFP, for the work there, because you may save our democracy with it. Thank you.
Carol, thank you so much. We appreciate those remarks so much. We appreciate your critical support and all of your leadership in the field. And I do want to echo what you said in terms of the threats that face our democracy today, and how there are many, many groups out there that are working on combating those threats and dealing with it head on. We're proud to be part of the broad democracy community that's fighting to protect our right to vote and our republic. And we're proud to be allied with those other groups you've mentioned, Protect Democracy, Brennan Center, and many more. So thank you for joining us and for your leadership. I should say at the outset,
one
yes,
more
please,
thing,
go ahead.
which is that there are now over 300, at least this is my awareness, it may be even more, but over 300 bills that have been submitted in, I think, 47 states.
Yes.
Various kinds of both voter suppression and changes in terms of election officials and what's acceptable in terms of election procedures. That is very scary for the upcoming elections.
Absolutely. In 19 of those states, 33 voter suppression laws have already been enacted. So it's clearly a threat that's coming from all quarters, and we need to be addressing them head on. Thank you. Thank you so much, Carol. And
thank you. And I'm going to happily listen to see what proceeds
wonderful
from here on in.
And
I want to encourage people to ask questions in the chat and ask questions during the Q&A. We're a small group, so we can have an intimate conversation. And I hope everybody gets a lot out of this.
Yes. Thank you, Carol. Thank you for highlighting. We will be having a Q&A session. We'll start off first with our presentations, and then the recording part of this session will end, so we can have a Q&A session for you to ask your questions. So I'll first start off with an introduction to our senior counsel, Courtney Hosteller, who will discuss our recent litigation challenging voter suppression laws in Arizona and Texas. Courtney?
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to chatting with you now and during the discussion about the lawsuits that we're bringing and the challenges that we are facing where it comes to voting rights and voter suppression, and our commitment at Free Speech for People to fighting back against this wave of voter suppression efforts that we've seen in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Last year, ahead of the election, as I think everybody knows, the pandemic put a lot of burden on voters. Potential voters were really facing challenges in getting to the polls and being able to register. Registration drives were canceled. People feared the safety of going to vote in person. There was slowdown in mail, you name it, there's a new barrier that popped up. And on the plus side, we saw quite a few states work actively to try to ease those burdens. But we also saw a number of states refuse to do that. And in those states, the pandemic became a tool for voter suppression. We brought lawsuits in several states, including Texas and Arizona, on behalf of some fantastic civil rights and civic engagement organizations. Mi Familia Vota was our plaintiff, a plaintiff in both lawsuits. We also represented the Texas State Conference of the NAACP and Arizona Coalition for Change to protect voters' rights during the pandemic in both states. When November rolled around, we saw an enormous increase of voter turnout, including, very importantly, an increased turnout amongst voters of color and traditionally marginalized communities. As mentioned, many voters benefited from expanded voting opportunities like longer registration periods and voting by mail, but other voters had to work hard to overcome barriers to their participation, including voting in some fairly unsafe conditions. So it was enormous, I think, victory for our democracy that so many people were able to get out to vote. And unfortunately, what we've seen, instead of a celebration of this victory, as Carol and John mentioned just a few minutes ago, a number of states responded by introducing and then passing voter suppression laws. These laws are similar in some ways, different in the other, and where they come together, we see their goal is really to make it difficult for people to vote, to roll back policies that made voting accessible. And specifically, these laws are going to burden Black, Latino, and Indigenous voters across the country. We are challenging such laws in 2 states, in Arizona and in Texas. So in Arizona, we are the only national group that is suing to block 2 voter suppression laws that passed earlier this year. We're working with pro bono counsel Mayor Brown and Quarles and Brady to represent several longstanding civic engagement organizations that are operating in Arizona. Mi Familia Vota, it's a name that should become familiar to you. Living United for Change in Arizona, again, Arizona Coalition for Change, and Chispa, Arizona. In Arizona, the primary method of voting is actually by mail. Even 2016, 75% of voters voted by mail. There was a huge increase in voters in the 2020 election. Voters of color were disproportionately likely to be new voters last year, and were also disproportionately likely to vote early by mail. And again, instead of celebrating the success story, the legislator passed these 2 laws that are going to make voting by mail difficult for many of its new voters, and specifically for Black, Latino, and Indigenous voters. So we're challenging, our lawsuit is going to seek to block both these laws. We've also brought a lawsuit in Texas to challenge an omnibus voter suppression law, SB 1. It was pushed through in a special session this past summer along extremely partisan lines. We're representing Mi Familia Vota there, as well as several individual plaintiffs with pro bono counsel Stoll Reeves and Lyons. Texas, it's already a very difficult place to vote. SB 1 makes it harder, especially for voters of color. There's not enough time in this presentation, maybe not enough time in the day to talk about all the problematic elements of this law, but to sample some of them. The law, it limits voting hours, prohibits drive-through voting and 24-hour voting. It makes it harder to vote by mail. It makes it more difficult to either give assistance to people who need assistance to vote, and makes it more difficult to obtain assistance. And that's true for people who require physical assistance to vote, who may have a physical disability, as well as people who might need language support to vote. The law implements monthly voting purges, and voters caught up in this purge, however incorrectly, are going to have to jump through major and costly hoops to prove their identity, which is not going to be required of any other registered voter. The law also opens the door to voter intimidation because it gives a lot of protection to so-called poll watchers. SB 1 is just another example of a law that responded to increased voter turnout, particularly among new voters and voters of color, with swift efforts to suppress them. Increased voter turnout should be celebrated. It means that our electorate is going to better reflect the diversity of our country's voters, and in turn means that our legislators and our laws will better reflect the will of the people. Laws like the one that we're challenging in Texas and Arizona, they undermine voting rights and they harm our democracy. And for these reasons, we are very committed as an organization to aggressively represent our clients and challenging these extremely harmful and unconstitutional laws.
Thank you so much, Courtney. We have a short video to show you about our case pending in Texas with Mi Familia Vota and individual voters. And I'm going to ask Oski Buckley, our Director of Administration and Finance, to cue that video up for you.
Governor Greg Abbott signing some of the most sweeping voting restrictions in the country. The new law bans drive-through voting in 24-hour polling locations, which have increased turnout among minorities.
Texas Republicans are not doing this to stop voter fraud. They're doing this to stop people of color from voting.
SB 1, which is the law that passed, is really an omnibus piece of voter suppression and voter intimidation legislation. It prohibits 24-hour voting and it prohibits drive-through voting. And there's no reason for this. It made voting accessible. And that is not something the Texas legislature is interested in making available, particularly in places like Harris County.
Texas is already one of the hardest states to vote in. We already have elections that are antiquated and have intentionally not progressed. This lawsuit and litigation is a tool that we have to fight back. One of our plaintiffs on the lawsuit is actually an individual who works 12-hour shifts, right? And they're a person that comes out of work really early in the morning. If we had 24-hour voting, that would probably be their preferred method of voting. These are people that are just so animated, that are contributing to our society, contributing to our state, and they want to be part of the decision-making process.
There's a number of provisions that threaten election officials with criminal offenses if they don't try to suppress voters and target voters. Telling poll workers that they're not allowed to intervene when poll watchers begin intimidating voters has nothing to do with fraud. That absolutely is just giving a green light to people who are going to make it terrifying to vote in Texas.
Texas has drastically changed in the past few decades. We're battling a lot of narratives of what Texas is. We're not a state where only a certain demographic votes. We're not a state where only a certain demographic lives. We're a diverse, young state looking for different opportunities, wanting economic growth and mobility. And we're just not willing to take a lot of the attacks anymore.
Thank you, Oski, for showing the video. And Elaine, I see that you have a question. We'll follow up in the Q&A session right after Ron's presentation with your question. So our next speaker is Ron Fine, our legal director, who will be talking about our work to uphold Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Ron?
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you about what we call for short our 14.3 project, because it gets really wordy to say Section 3 of the 14th Amendment over and over again. But first, I want to set some larger context. Beginning in 2017, we expanded our work, which until then had focused mainly on the threats of big money in politics and corporate abuse of power, to also include a new category of threats to democracy, including corruption at the highest levels of government, authoritarian abuses of government power, and voter intimidation and other forms of political violence, We were the first national organization to call for President Trump's impeachment on the basis of his violations of the Constitution's emoluments clauses on the day he took the oath of office. Some people said that was too soon, but we argued then that if Congress taught Trump that he could take money from foreign powers without any consequences, then he'd be emboldened to go even further. And I think history bore us out on that. In October of 2020, among hundreds of election-related lawsuits filed that year, Free Speech for People filed the only case that exposed and challenged the comprehensive and systematic scheme of voter intimidation that was carried out by Trump and the leaders of his administration and campaign to suppress the vote of his political opponents, including by encouraging violence and other forms of intimidation. Now, that violence didn't occur on election day itself. It came 64 days later on January 6th. And that's what brings us to Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. I'm going to talk about what is 14.3, how it relates to January 6th, how it's implemented, and what we're doing. So Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, and Oski can bring up the slides there. You can see that the highlighted text indicates what the provision says is that any person who has previously taken an oath to support the Constitution of the United States and then who engages in insurrection or rebellion is prohibited from holding any office, civil or military, under the United States. What that means is that anyone who's held any government position at any level, and Oski, you can take the slides down now, thank you, who is prohibited on a lifetime basis. There is a procedure for Congress to change it, but otherwise they're prohibited from any further federal or state office. That was passed in 1865, or it was passed in 1868 in response to what happened in 1865, which is that right after the end of the Civil War, the Senate and the House of Representatives convened, and all these senators and representatives from the ex-Confederate states showed up wanting to take their seats. And the Republicans in Congress were rightfully infuriated by the presence of these unrepentant rebels. So that's why Congress enacted this provision of the 14th Amendment. Now, to most law students and lawyers, it hasn't been a focus, this Section 3. The more familiar part of the 14th Amendment is its first section, which talks about equal protection of the laws. But at the time that Congress passed the 14th Amendment, Section 3 was actually more important to them than Section 1, because they saw it as a necessary preventative measure in order to ensure that people who had previously betrayed their oath of office and taken up arms or supported those who'd taken up arms against the US government would never be again in a position to do that. So that brings us to the current day. So January 6th was not just a riot, not just an incident of trespassing in the Capitol. The storming of the Capitol meets the definition of an insurrection. It was an attempt to use force to disrupt the peaceful transition of power, to overthrow the government by preventing the new lawfully elected administration from ever taking power. So the question is, how does Section 3 apply to the current situation? So first of all, the text and history of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment don't specify a particular enforcement mechanism. And that's important, but we do know how it was enforced during the Reconstruction era after the Civil War. And the answer is, quite interestingly, it was applied by all manner of officials in state, local, and federal governments. It's clear from the history that it's not limited to people who have been convicted of criminal charges of insurrection. And while new congressional action would be useful in this case, it's not necessary. And we support congressional action. And in February, we joined a letter of a broad advocacy coalition calling upon Congress to pass legislation that would help with the enforcement of Section 3, but it's not necessary to do so. And Congress's approach at this point seems to be to rely totally on the select committee that they established to investigate the events of January 6th. And that committee's done some good work, but it doesn't seem to reflect the urgency of the moment. And more importantly, the House of Representatives is not the only constitutional actor charged with applying the Constitution and Section 3 of the 14th Amendment in particular. Our campaign aims at a different type of constitutional actor, which are the state officials who determine who appears on the ballots. In most states, that's a Secretary of State. In some cases, it's State Board of Elections. And this past summer, we wrote letters to the top election officials of all 50 states and the District of Columbia. And we said, you too have sworn an oath to support and defend the Constitution. You too, in everything that you do, must be acting consistently with the Constitution. And it turns out that it is not uncommon for people who are constitutionally ineligible for the office of president or for other offices to file paperwork to run, nevertheless. So you have underage people signing up to run for president, or sometimes somebody who's foreign born filing paperwork to run for president, which violates the eligibility criteria in the Constitution. And state elections officials routinely deny them appearance on the ballot. Sometimes they've challenged that in court and they've always lost. In our letters to the officials, we cited both federal constitutional principles and also, in some cases, specific state laws and precedents supporting the state officials' authorities and obligations to exclude Trump and any other insurrectionists who may run for federal or state office from the ballot. And we certainly don't expect all 51 of these officials to agree with us. And it's also the case that if Trump is excluded from the ballot in any state in this basis, he has a right to have his day in court. He can challenge that action by the Secretary of State, sue and argue that he is in fact eligible because he didn't engage in insurrection. And we're prepared for that, and we stand ready to help defend any election official who is challenged on that basis. But the important question that you may have is, why did we launch this campaign now in 2021? Well, we can't file a formal ballot challenge to Trump's eligibility in any state just yet, because state election processes for 2024 haven't geared up yet. But this is obviously going to be a controversial issue. And we saw 2020, and really going back to Bush versus Gore in 2000, that there's been a pattern of novel and high stakes election law questions being decided under the white hot light of an incredibly urgent, tight time frame. And we think it's important that rather than wait until the urgency of an impending election, state elections officials, and if necessary, the courts and Congress, if it chooses to, begin to address this critical issue now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. We have a short video to show you as well about this 14.3 campaign, and Oski will cue that up for you now, and then we'll turn it over to the Q&A session.
Considering a run for President of the United States? The U.S. Constitution sets a few guidelines. You must be at least 35 years of age, you must be a natural-born citizen of the United States and a resident for at least 14 years. And you cannot take an oath to protect the Constitution and then incite a violent insurrection.
We will never give up, we will never concede. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
By inciting a violent attack on Congress in an effort to prevent the certification of his own electoral defeat, Donald Trump engaged in insurrection and violated his oath of office. According to the U.S. Constitution, this makes him ineligible to run for future office. Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, passed in the aftermath of the Civil War, disqualifies from public office any individual who has taken an oath to uphold the Constitution and then engages in insurrection or rebellion against the United States, or gives aid and comfort to those who do. Donald Trump's words and actions incited a violent assault on our nation's capital. 5 Americans died, and more than 140 officers were injured. Free Speech for People is making clear to secretaries of state and chief election officials across the country that they must follow the mandate of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment and bar Trump from the ballot in 2024.